And we're live.
We're live. We're live. And by live, we mean pre-recorded.
That's right. That is right. We are super live right now. Genesis chapter 17. Let's get the ball rolling.
Yeah, I'll do it. So,
Yeah.
chapter 17, verse 1. Now, when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless. I will establish my covenant between me and you, and I will multiply you exceedingly. Abram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, As for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you will be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer, but your name shall be called Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings will come forth from you. I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your descendants after you. I will give to you and your descendants after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. So, just in this first section, we kind of have God reiterating the promise and the covenant once again. And so we see God give Abraham a call to the moral behavioral standard. And then also we see this is where he changes Abram's name. And so, as is already defined in the text, from what I read, Abram means exalted father, and then Abraham means father of a multitude, which that's exactly what God says in the next verse. So, and then he once again promises the land of Canaan will be an everlasting possession for the Israelites. So,
Yeah, I think you see, the Lord appears before Abram, just stepping back a little bit earlier in the passage. Abram's 99 years old, and the Lord appeared to Abram. So the Lord is appearing before him. So there seems to be a vision. This is not just a vision or an audio experience. This is an actual visual experience, which to me is very interesting. Of course, Abram immediately falls on his face. And then I think you see reference to the covenant here. Now, this seems a little bit different than the previous mentions, right? Because you see, I will establish my covenant between me and you, where it seems like the previous covenant was established was a unilateral covenant, where this seems like a little more bilateral in nature. It's my understanding this bilateral nature comes from not the granting of the land to Abraham or necessarily the descendants, but maybe an additional blessing on top of that land and those descendants. And so more descendants specifically, because God's really calling Abraham to be Abram in this moment, Abram to walk before God blameless. And I will establish and I will multiply you exceedingly, almost as if like more exceedingly than already been promised to him through the unilateral covenant. And it's also my understanding that a specific land is mentioned in this section too, whereas previously the specific land wasn't given by name. I think it was more.
yeah,
Go ahead.
it was given by borders. So, yeah, God didn't. I don't know that God said the land of Palestine, but he described the land because he gave borders, I believe.
Yeah. Cool.
He still gave boundaries or whatever.
Verse 9, God said further to Abraham, now as for you, you shall keep my covenant you and your descendants after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant, which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised, and you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be the sign of the covenant between you and me. And every male among you who is 8 days old shall be circumcised throughout your generations. A servant who is born in the house or who is bought with money from any foreigner who is not of your descendants. A servant who is born in your house or who is bought with your money shall surely be circumcised. Thus shall my covenant be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. But an uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. It seems like a good part to start unpacking a little bit. Thoughts here?
Yeah, I mean, we see here that God gives like a behavioral expectations, right? And so while it's unconditional that he's going to provide the land, he still has behavioral expectations, and there are going to be rules, right, for Abraham and his descendants.
Um, some of the commentaries talk about why the flesh of the foreskin, and I think it's this reminder that Abraham's these next generations of people, um, are going to be blessed because of this covenant that God has made, this unilateral covenant. It's not necessarily because Abraham's this extra special guy. It's because God's special and God chose Abraham for this particular honor. And so, obviously, reproduction and descendants come through the reproductive system. And so, this would be a regular reminder of those descendants. So, that's one of the ideas. It doesn't specifically say that, but I think you could potentially look into this and say, hey, that's reasonable to consider.
Yeah.
And I think we also dig into verse 14. But an uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. Now that's a pretty big deal. Very big deal, actually. God's saying that, hey, if you're wanting to belong to this people group, you need to be circumcised. Otherwise, if you're not circumcised, you are going to be cut off from his people. That person's going to be cut off from the people. And not only that, you've broken the covenant, which, God's calling the shots here. It's not like Abraham is like, God's establishing a covenant between Abraham and himself. And really, the descendants don't really have a whole lot, they can choose not to participate in the covenant, but you're going to be cut off from God's people essentially. And this is Old Testament, of course. If we look into the New Testament, the whole idea of circumcision is no longer a requirement. We're no longer under the requirement of circumcision in the after Jesus came to fulfill the law. That's no longer a requirement. Any other thoughts before we move on to the next deal?
Yeah, I like what you had to say. Can you address verse 12? Every male among you who is 8 days old shall be circumcised throughout your generations. Did you have any extra insight on that?
I will say that through my reading from from commentaries, there seems to be a medical um, benefit to being circumcised on day 8 as opposed to day 3, for example, or day 9 or 10. You can't say like this. I think I haven't done a ton of research on this, right? I just read some commentaries on this. Day 8, you seem to have a excessive level of blood clotting materials in your body, such that you benefit. And actually, after day 8, it actually goes down a little bit. These blood clotting materials. Highly recommend reading Dr. Constable's commentary. We can put that in the description box. You can get more information on there. Dr. Constable is not a doctor by any means, so I wouldn't uh, take that as everything he's saying in there is completely medically sound, but I do think that's somewhat interesting. You'd have to do additional research to really qualify that. I take Dr. Constable as more of a theologian than a medical doctor.
Yeah, so, but I think it's interesting because I think multiple times in the Bible we see modern medical science kind of running parallel to these ancient cultures and what they were doing, which to me, I mean, it points more to the legitimacy of God as well. So,
Fair enough.
yeah.
You want to read this next section?
Yep. Verse 15. Then God said to Abraham, "As for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and indeed I will give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she will be a mother of nations. Kings of people will come from her." Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said in his heart, "Will a child be born to a man 100 years old? And will Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child?" And Abraham said to God, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you." But God said, "No, but Sarah, your wife, will bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I will bless him, and I will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. He shall become the father of 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you at this season next year." When he finished talking with him, God went up from Abraham.
Well, we have Sarai now has a new name as well. And Sarai, is my understanding, actually meant Sarai signifies my princess. Sarah signifies a princess, namely of multitudes.
Okay.
So seems, slight deviation in meaning there. Um, but I think we recognize that in the previous um, chapters, um, Abram has a son, Ishmael, not according to how God ultimately really intended for Abram to have a son. He intended for Abram to have a son through Sarai. However, they took it into their own hands and ultimately um, made a decision to not really put their trust in God, but instead put their trust in themselves. And I think this is a really fascinating moment. Abram does something that Abram and Sarai do something that perhaps they think is wise. They're going to help God out. And what you'll see is all this actually blows up right in their face.
Yeah.
It's actually a huge, huge negative in their life. And Abraham at this moment is actually telling God, God, why not just have Ishmael live before you? God says, no, 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 no. This covenant is not going to be with Ishmael. This covenant is going to be with your son Isaac through Sarah. So that's a really, really big deal. We got two sons here, Ishmael and Isaac. Ishmael is going to be blessed as well, the son of Hagar, but the covenant is not going to be with Ishmael. It's going to be with Isaac. That is a really, really big deal because there's different religions around the world that might there's different beliefs on this on really who's the blessed son. As you can see in the scripture right here, it's very clearly Isaac. Now, at the same time, Ishmael is going to become the father of 12 princes. That's kind of interesting, considering that you have the 12 tribes of Israel, which comes through the line of Isaac, and then through Jacob, aka Israel. Jacob's name, for those who don't know, we're going to learn about Jacob coming up. But Isaac, the son that we're reading about right now, is actually going to have a son himself, two sons actually, Jacob and Esau. Isaac's going to have two sons, Jacob and Esau. Jacob is the father of the 12 tribes of Israel, which we'll learn about here in the future. But I find that very, very fascinating. Of course, Jesus had 12 apostles. So I'm not saying the correlation is 1-to-1 here, but it's particularly interesting, right? 12 tribes of Israel, 12 princes coming through the line of Ishmael.
It
Not
is interesting. And when you're talking about Ishmael, and it's actually in Genesis 25 verses 13 through 15, I believe it talks about Ishmael's descendants or his sons that are being predicted here. So, but one of the things we see, Abraham, when God first comes to him, Abraham's still hung up on this Ishmael deal, right? He thinks that this promise is going to come through Ishmael, and so Ishmael, like you already super clarified, is not the son of promise. You know, I've heard it explained that Ishmael represents like our fleshly way to try to achieve something, and Isaac is symbolic of God's miraculous way. Not symbolic; it actually happened, but it's what we see as when we trust God and God does something miraculously to achieve something.
I would also add one more thing. You also see here that Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said in his heart, "Will a child be born to a man 100 years old? And will Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child?" Keep in mind, Abraham only lives to about 175 years old. So, I mean, they're up in years, so this
Yep.
definitely is going to be a miracle. There's no question about it. Like, there's going to be absolutely no logical explanation to why Sarah has a kid except through a miracle from God. Now,
Yep.
you could also look at this and see Abraham laughing, maybe in skepticism, right? Maybe in doubt. I think that was how I initially read this section. However, I have also heard commentators specifically point out a kind of a distinction between how Abraham laughs here and how you'll see Sarah laugh coming up. And Abraham, there's some indication that it might have been viewed as Abraham laughing almost in awe and wonder, like almost in joy or almost excitement. It's like, wow, I can't believe it. Are you serious? Is this really going to happen? Not like in like a mocking, like skeptical way, but perhaps more of a exciting, like maybe in an anticipation, really. Of course, he asked several questions after this um, that might further, establish. You could potentially see that, hey, is this him being in doubt? You can ask. I think you can ask follow-up questions about something that you earnestly am excited about and hoping for, um, while at the same time ask questions. And so I don't know. I just find that interesting because you're going to see, and here's why you might believe that this is not in a not a mocking, but in a doubtful, sarcastic tone. one other reason why you might not view this particular section to look like that is because God rebukes Sarah whenever she laughs. Okay? Whereas you don't really see God rebuking Abraham in this moment.
Yeah.
So let's finish out this next section. Who is that? Is this my turn or your turn?
Yeah, I think it's your turn.
Okay. Verse 23. Then Abraham took Ishmael his son and all the servants who were born in his house and all who were bought with his money, every male among the men of Abraham's household, and circumcised the flesh of their foreskin in the very same day as God had said to him. Now Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, and Ishmael, his son, was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. And the very same day Abraham was circumcised in Ishmael his son. All the men of his household who were born in the house or bought with money from a foreigner were circumcised with him.
Yeah, so we see that right away when Abraham gets the commandment, he just goes and does it, right? Right away, he was obedient and circumcising himself and all the others. And I think this is one of those areas or this is one of those chapters where we look back and say, yeah, hey, Abraham was faithful here, right? I mean, he didn't see, he was he thought the promise was going to be with Ishmael. It's not. So I think he's trusting God with that. And I think we see that in also his behavior and action, right? I mean, we see this promise from God and we see Abraham follow the behavioral guidelines that he gives or the standards or whatever you want to call that. So, yeah, I mean, this is a chapter that Abraham did well in. And I mean, he's going to be blessed for that, right? I mean, and that's just kind of one of the things for us is when we are obedient to God, we receive that blessing. And Abraham does a good job of just like looking to the next thing he needs to do to be obedient to God and not getting hung up.
Agreed. He doesn't play around. The same
Yep.
day, he's going around
Yep.
circumcising everybody. Literally no hesitation. Think about that. I think that's epic. He
Yeah.
didn't think about it. He was like, all right, boys, let's get this ball rolling. That couldn't have been a fun thing, in my opinion, to get circumcised. You know, when you weren't waking up thinking that was going to happen, right? All of a sudden, it's
Yeah.
like, all right, fellas, let's get together. Guess who? Guess who God appeared to today? You're never going to believe this.
Yeah.
Um, So anyways, there's definitely but he doesn't wait, and this, like I said,
Yeah.
this likely wasn't something that people were really looking forward to and like, hey, I can't wait to do this. But he was obedient and he followed God immediately, didn't play around. I think we could definitely apply that to our own lives when God's called us to do something that maybe feels uncomfortable, that we're not necessarily excited about, to just rip the band-aid off. Like, just don't wait, just do it. So, any final thoughts on this?
No, I mean, I think, I mean, just that I think that, once again, this is a chapter that Abraham did well in, this is impressive. And uh, I think that, as believers, we need to have an open mindedness toward God. And I know we do. This idea that Abraham was not, from my view, Abraham was not being disobedient by trying to go or by going and having Ishmael. It was disobedient, but he was trying to help God out. And he still believed that God was going to fulfill all these things through Ishmael. But when God said he wasn't, Abraham just went with it. And so a lot of times when the circumstances aren't playing out the way they thought they were going to, or things like that. Like just us being as believers, us being willing to just roll with the punches and follow God, no matter how different it looks than what we thought it was going to, is something we need to do that Abraham did well.
Agreed. Cool. Well, this is exciting. I mean,
Yeah.
we got Abraham and we got some descendants, we got some covenants. We've seen some obedience here. And I think this to me this is a motivating chapter. You
Yeah.
know, Abraham encourages me to, not sit around but to take action when I feel like
Yeah.
God's, trying to speak to me in my life.
For sure.
Chapter, real quick, we had the introduction. We had a mention of the covenant again, mention of the covenant, and we also had the introduction of circumcision, which is a big deal for the rest of the Old Testament, really, for that matter. Um, and even there's some implications in the New Testament, of course, as well. Um, I can't remember what are those, Justin, by the way, the implications?
Well, the circumcision of the heart, right? About yeah. So the circumcision, so that's kind of this symbol that we need to be circumcised from our flesh, and so God circumcises the flesh of our heart, so that and this is in reference to for believers, and what I view like a sanctification type process. This idea that the Holy Spirit is helping us grow in spiritual maturity. Like we're not on our own. You know, when God opens our eyes and we put our faith in Him, we're not on our own to live this life just with these rules that are really hard to manage. That's not it. It's God's helping us. Like God's helping us grow and mature. And I see that. And you could also say that in a way of He's circumcising our heart. He's helping us to grow more to appreciate spiritual things and be less bogged down by worldly things.
Does circumcision save you?
Absolutely not.
I think that's a fair question to ask. I think Jesus challenges the Pharisees and the Sadducees with some question similar, though. You know,
Right.
it's like God can make sons of Abraham from these stones,
Yeah.
from these rocks, right? Just because you're circumcised, just because you're from the Jewish lineage, doesn't mean you're automatically saved. So I like what you mentioned, circumcision of the heart. In the Old Testament, really, this was just an act of obedience, um, an act of. This is a moment in which you act out your faith. You know, you have faith in these promises, in this covenant, and then you act on that faith by being circumcised as God called them to do. Now, of course, all these babies that are about to be born, they're going to have the pleasure, they're going to have the pleasure of being circumcised, and they don't have to worry about that as an adult, you know. Cool. Chapter 17, complete. Chapter 18, you are next
Yep.
milestone. So, I'm gonna leave a 5-star review on chapter 17.
Yeah.
I'm gonna hold out.
Abraham, you did good. You did good, kid.
I'm gonna hold out my review for 18 in the next chapter. Thanks for
Like
joining.
it.
Thanks for joining us, bros. Really excited. If you have any questions or comments, throw those in the least. Comment, like, subscribe. Mainly subscribe so you can and put those alerts on.
Yeah.
Subscribe, put those alerts on so that you can hang out with us for the next one. We're plowing through the Bible fast.
Go.
We're getting this.
Plowing, baby.
We got our work gloves on and we are plowing. So, guys, look forward to the next one. See you later.
Yes.